No scientist had found one, and no large-scale survey had detected any. The United States had even declared the species completely extinct twice. Then, in October 1981, in Métis, Shep, an ordinary ranch dog, dragged a strange carcass out of the bushes. His owner, John, did not recognize the extremely rare animal and nearly tossed it into a pile of weeds along the Graybull River. Lucille wanted to preserve the animal as a specimen, so they took it to a taxidermist in town. With just one look, the taxidermist immediately recognized it. It was a black-footed ferret, the only ferret species native to North America. Biologists immediately rushed to meet Itzy, but their excitement quickly turned into panic. They discovered a serious problem that put the species at risk of disappearing once again. Every effort seemed powerless until Seth Willey made a phone call that changed everything. It set in motion an unprecedented plan, forcing conservation agencies into legal and technological territory they had never faced before. Black-footed ferrets once numbered in the hundreds of thousands, ranging from southern Canada all the way to the Texas Panhandle. More precisely, that was prairie dog territory, and black-footed ferrets followed wherever they went. Through evolution, black-footed ferrets became extremely dependent on this species. Prairie dogs make up about 90% of their diet, and their burrows also serve as homes for the ferrets. If prairie dogs disappear, black-footed ferrets cannot survive either, and that is exactly what happened. Within just a few decades, about 98% of prairie dogs vanished, and their habitat was reduced to less than 2% of its original range. Black-footed ferret populations collapsed along with them. Habitat loss and disease also played a role, but the biggest cause was still the disappearance of prairie dogs. Humans nearly drove both species to extinction. In 1967, the black-footed ferret was placed on the endangered species list. Although a small population from Millette County was brought into captivity for breeding, the effort failed. When the last individual died, the species was declared extinct. But 2 years later, Shep unexpectedly found them again, just as you saw at the beginning. Scientists rushed the last 18 black-footed ferrets left on Earth to a captive breeding center. But this time, they achieved something extraordinary. More than 9,000 kits were born. You heard that right. Of those, 4,300 were released back into the wild. But was this really a reason to celebrate? Only 7 of the original 18 animals passed their genes on to future generations, meaning that nearly the entire population today consists of close relatives. This extremely narrow gene pool reduces fertility, disease resistance, and the ability to adapt. The evidence became clear after their release, when plague once again killed large numbers of them. By 1996, the black-footed ferret was once again classified as extinct in the wild. A few dozen individuals still remained in conservation centers, but researchers had learned from the past and no longer bred them as rapidly as possible. They first had to solve an even greater crisis: genetics. Later, we will explore how Seth Willey of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service contacted Revive and Restore to find a way to use genetic material from ferrets that had already died to address this genetic crisis. But that plan was possible only because of a visionary decision made more than 3 decades earlier. As black-footed ferrets were disappearing rapidly and biologists were racing to save the last remaining individuals, Oliver Ryder, director of conservation genetics at San Diego Zoo Global, had a different idea. He asked biologists from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department to send him tissue samples from a black-footed ferret named Mitzi. The samples were not meant to be used immediately, because at the time, there was no way to use them. Ryder wanted to place them in the frozen zoo, a facility he had quietly been building since 1972. There, cell lines from rare species were preserved at extremely low temperatures in preparation for a future that no one could yet imagine. Today, the frozen zoo holds more than 11,500 cell lines from over 1,300 species and subspecies, making it the most diverse collection of living wildlife cells in the world. At the time Ryder collected those black-footed ferret cells, the prevailing scientific view was that frozen tissue could never be used to create a living animal. Even so, he continued collecting samples based on one simple principle: storage was inexpensive, and the future was very long. In 1988, a female black-footed ferret named Willa died at a research facility. She had never produced offspring, so her genes were not passed into the recovery program built from the 7 founding animals. However, a sample of Willa's skin was successfully cultured and preserved in San Diego. Those cells remained frozen for 32 years. In 2013, Seth Willey of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service contacted Revive and Restore and raised a question that had never before been asked in the recovery program. Could biotechnology restore lost genetic diversity to the black-footed ferret population? Ben Novak and his colleagues began examining the historic cell samples stored in the frozen zoo. Their findings drew particular attention to Willa. Because she had never produced offspring, her genes were completely absent from the modern population. The analysis also showed that Willa carried significantly more unique genetic variants than a typical living black-footed ferret. That changed the entire meaning of the preserved cells. Willa could become an eighth genetic founder, adding variants that the breeding program based on the other 7 ancestors could never recreate on its own. But scientists could not simply remove the cells and begin cloning immediately. The black-footed ferret is an endangered species protected under federal law. The use of tissue, the creation of embryos, the transportation of animals, and the use of another species as a surrogate mother were all unprecedented within this recovery program. The project had to prove that its goal was not merely to create an attention-grabbing animal, but to improve the genetic health of the entire population. The plan also had to undergo environmental review, public comment, and a permitting process conducted by the same agency responsible for protecting the species. It was not until 2018 that Revive and Restore received authorization to study the cloning of historic cell lines and explore genetic technologies that could help black-footed ferrets resist plague. After that, Regen, a company with years of experience in animal cloning, officially joined the project. First, scientists collected an egg cell from an ordinary domestic ferret and removed the DNA-containing nucleus, leaving behind an empty egg cell. Next, they inserted the nucleus of one of Willa's preserved cells, which contained her complete and valuable genome, into that egg. After activating the cell so that it would begin growing and dividing into an embryo, the scientists implanted the embryo into another domestic ferret, which would serve as a surrogate mother. Finally, the pregnant surrogate was transferred to a specialized conservation center, where she was closely monitored until she gave birth. This approach was extremely safe. By using a domestic ferret as the surrogate, scientists did not need to handle or endanger any of the few surviving black-footed ferrets. On the 10th of December 2020, at the National Black Footed Ferret Conservation Center in Fort Collins, Colorado, a single female kit was born. She was named Elizabeth Ann. Genetically, she was Willa the ferret that had died nearly 3 decades earlier. During her first few days, Elizabeth Ann was quite timid. When the kits competed for food, she often remained underneath the others and was pushed aside. Her caretakers worried that the first cloned individual might be weaker than normal. But when Elizabeth Ann opened her eyes, everything changed. She began playfully biting her littermates and pushing them aside. She was healthy, energetic, and displayed all the normal behaviors of a black-footed ferret. Elizabeth Ann became the first successfully cloned individual of an endangered species native to the United States. However, when Elizabeth Ann reached adulthood, a problem emerged. She developed hydrometra, a condition that caused fluid to build up inside her uterus, while the rest of her reproductive system had not developed fully. Elizabeth Ann required surgery and was unable to reproduce. Fortunately, other cells from Willa were still preserved in frozen storage. In 2023, 2 new clones were created, Noreen at the National Black Footed Ferret Conservation Center in Colorado, and Antonia at the Smithsonian Research Facility in Front Royal, Virginia. Both carried the same nuclear genome as Willa, but this time, scientists closely monitored their health and reproductive ability. The breakthrough came in June 2024. Antonia naturally mated with a male named Urchin and gave birth to 3 kits. One died shortly after birth, but the other 2, a female named Sibbert and a male named Red Cloud, grew up healthy. By the end of 2025, 15 individuals in the breeding population carried Willa's genetic lineage. This finally established Willa as the species' 8th founder and broke the genetic bottleneck that had limited the recovery program for 4 decades. For the first time since 1987, black-footed ferrets had more than 7 genetic foundations to rely on. In fact, when the project began, the team was not entirely confident that it would work with black-footed ferrets. Before that, Revive and Restore, Regen, and the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance had collaborated on a trial involving Przewalski's horse, an extremely rare and endangered wild horse whose gene pool was becoming increasingly narrow. Scientists used frozen cells from an individual whose genetic lineage was poorly represented in the modern population. The cell nucleus was inserted into a domestic horse egg after its genetic material had been removed, creating an embryo that was then implanted into a domestic horse, serving as a surrogate mother. As a result, 2 cloned horses were born, Kurt on the 6th of August 2020 and Ollie on the 17th of February 2023. The goal was not to create genetically identical animals for display, but to return a historic genetic lineage to the breeding program. However, the success achieved with Przewalski's horses and black-footed ferrets does not mean that this method can be applied to every species. Black-footed ferrets benefited from several rare and favorable conditions. Willa's cells had remained alive in frozen storage for more than 30 years. Domestic ferrets were close enough relatives to provide egg cells and serve as surrogates. Ferret reproductive techniques had already been studied, and the captive population had detailed pedigree records that allowed scientists to carefully manage how the new genes were passed on. For rhinos, birds, reptiles, or amphibians, these conditions may not exist. Scientists may be unable to find a closely related species suitable for providing egg cells or serving as a surrogate. They may not fully understand the process of embryo development, or they may lack enough living cell samples and funding to carry out a large number of unsuccessful trials. Therefore, cloning technology is not a universal solution for every endangered species. It works only when the cells, the surrogate species, the reproductive techniques, and the conservation program have all been prepared in advance. Returning to the black-footed ferret, the cloning project brought Willa's genetic lineage back into the population, but that alone was still not enough to save the species. As you may remember, their fate has always been closely tied to prairie dogs. However, across much of the American West, prairie dogs are still considered music pests that need to be eliminated. The poisoning campaigns that once wiped out 98% of prairie dogs have slowed across much of the region, but the damage has not been reversed. In some grassland areas, these campaigns continue to this day as part of government programs. Black-footed ferrets have been saved in freezers and breeding facilities, but their habitat has not. Without prairie dogs, black-footed ferrets have neither food nor burrow systems in which to shelter and raise their young. A typical reintroduction site needs at least about 3,000 acres of land with a prairie dog population large and stable enough to support them. But prairie dogs are not important only to black-footed ferrets. Their underground towns support more than 150 other species, from burrowing owls, swift foxes, and badgers to snakes, hawks, eagles, and coyotes. Their tunnels provide shelter, their digging helps aerate the soil, and their grazing encourages the growth of fresh young grass that attracts bison and pronghorn. So when humans eliminated prairie dogs, they did not simply take away the black-footed ferret's prey. They removed one of the main supports of the entire North American grassland ecosystem. For black-footed ferrets to survive in the wild, conservationists must save both the ferrets and the prairie dogs. Ferrets are vaccinated against plague, while the disease-carrying fleas inside prairie dog burrows must be controlled. Peanut butter-scented vaccine pellets are also scattered across the grasslands for prairie dogs to eat, helping protect both the ferrets' food supply and their shelter. Before being released, captive-bred ferrets must also learn how to hunt prairie dogs and avoid predators. After release, they are monitored using radio transmitters, thermal cameras, and motion sensors to determine why so many individuals disappear. At Heartland Ranch in Colorado, 105 ferrets have been released since 2022, but the number that survived and formed a stable population has remained lower than expected. This shows that restoring genetic diversity solves only part of the problem. To truly save the species, humans must also restore enough prairie dogs, control disease, and create a grassland large enough for the ferrets to hunt, reproduce, and survive on their own without remaining completely dependent on human care. According to a Smithsonian update dated the 18th of May 2026, only about 400 black-footed ferrets currently remain in the wild. The conservation facility in Front Royal, Virginia, alone has produced more than 1,200 kits since 1989, about 800 of which entered programs designed to prepare them for release. The facility currently maintains 27 adult ferrets in a carefully managed breeding population. Most of the ferrets there still reproduce naturally. Scientists select males and females based on their pedigrees and then allow them to mate. On the 11th of May 2026, a 2-year-old female named Mizuno became a mother for the first time, giving birth to 6 kits fathered by a male named Dickory. Both the mother and her litter were healthy. Mizuno nursed and cared for the kits herself with very little human intervention. This was considered a relatively large litter, but it was still within the species' natural reproductive capacity. Black-footed ferret kits are born hairless, with their eyes closed, and are completely dependent on their mother. At around 3 weeks old, their eyes begin to open. At 4 to 5 weeks, they start eating meat. At 6 weeks, they begin leaving the nest, and by about 7 weeks, they must start practicing how to hunt live prey. By 3 months of age, they are nearly full-grown and can live independently. Ferrets scheduled for release must also complete a survival training program, where they learn to hunt, use burrows, and limit contact with humans. Individuals that do not develop sufficient survival skills may be kept for breeding instead of being released into the wild. Even Willa's clone genetic lineage has reproduced naturally. Antonia and her descendants produced multiple litters in 2025. This proves that the main challenge is no longer the ferret's ability to reproduce. The black-footed ferret's gene pool had become so limited that scientists had to reach back 32 years into the past, searching inside a tank of liquid nitrogen for the remaining genetic variants that could help the entire species survive. That is the price of trying to rebuild a species that humans nearly erased from the wild. But the black-footed ferret received that second chance only because of an almost unbelievably fragile chain of coincidences. If Lucille Hogg had not wanted to preserve the animal as a specimen, if John Hogg had thrown the carcass into the weeds along the Graybull River, as he had originally planned, if the taxidermist had failed to recognize the creature lying on his table, or had not known whom to contact, and if Oliver Ryder had not decided to preserve the cells of a ferret that died in 1988, even though no one at the time knew what those cells might someday be used for, if just one link in that chain had been missing, this story might not exist today. The Hogg family ranch still stands near Meteets, beneath the Absaroka Range, on the same grasslands where Shep once ran on a September night in 1981. In 2016, black-footed ferrets were reintroduced at the nearby Pitchfork Ranch, in the very region where the last known population had once been discovered. Alan Hogg, the son of John and Lucille, grew up hearing the story of the morning Shep brought the carcass home. He recalled that every time his father retold the story, his face lit up. Then, in 2022, Alan stood on the land his family had ranched for generations and watched black-footed ferrets being released, one by one, before disappearing into prairie dog burrows. More than 40 years ago, a dog brought one of these animals out of the darkness. Now its descendants are making their own way back underground. But this is not a perfect ending. Cloning restored Willa's genes, but it cannot restore the grasslands on its own, stop plague, or protect prairie dogs. Science can reopen a door that was almost completely closed, but keeping that door open depends on what humans choose to do next. Do you think cloning should become a tool for saving species on the brink of extinction, or should humans focus more on protecting them before it is too late? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to continue exploring stories where nature, science, and seemingly small decisions can change the fate of an entire species, subscribe to the channel and join us on the journeys ahead.